In 1872, inside the reading room of the British Museum, a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith sat hunched over a small clay tablet covered in wedge-shaped marks. He had been working for years, cataloguing thousands of broken fragments pulled from the ruins of Nineveh, the great library city of ancient Assyria. Most of the pieces were administrative records, grain counts, tax receipts, court rulings. Tedious but necessary work. Then he found something else. As he pieced together the cuneiform signs, line by line, a story began to emerge. A god warning a man to build a boat, a flood that destroyed everything, a survivor releasing birds to find dry land. Smith reportedly became so excited that witnesses said he began tearing off his clothes in the middle of the museum. He had just read, for the first time in nearly 3,000 years, an ancient account of a catastrophic flood, one that echoed, almost line for line, the flood story in the book of Genesis. But this tablet was older, much older. That discovery cracked open a question historians and archaeologists are still trying to answer today. Why did the oldest civilization we know of, the Sumerians of southern Mesopotamia, leave behind not just myths of gods and kings, but detailed, almost clinical descriptions of how societies fall apart? Because the flood tablet Smith found was not alone. Over the following century and a half, archaeologists excavating sites across modern-day Iraq uncovered tens of thousands more clay tablets. Buried in royal archives, temple storerooms, and the rubble of burned libraries, these texts recorded far more than kings and gods. They recorded warnings, some of these texts describe corruption, modern science about rulers who stopped really happened, about real drought and famine, real droughts, about knowledge lost to fire and neglect. Others describe things far stranger, to turn against unexplained humanity. Lights in the sky, prophecies of chaos returning, warnings that civilizations rise only to be undone by their own arrogance. Over the next 2.5 hours, we are going to walk through 10 of these tablets, some famous, some far more obscure, and examine what they actually say, what mainstream historians and archaeologists believe about them, and where legitimate scholarship ends and speculation begins. We'll compare Sumerian accounts to similar stories from Egypt, from the Americas, from India and China, because one of the strangest things about these ancient warnings is how often they rhyme with warnings from cultures that, as far as we know, never had any contact with Mesopotamia at all. And in the final section of this documentary, we'll turn the lens toward the present day, not to claim that Bronze Age scribes predicted the 21st century, no serious historian argues that, but to ask a more interesting question. Why do so many people today feel that these ancient warnings speak directly to our own moment? What is it about climate instability, political dysfunction, and the erosion of public trust that makes a 5,000-year-old text suddenly feel current again? Before we go any further, it's important to set expectations clearly, because this is a topic where sensationalism spreads fast and nuance gets lost. The Sumerians were real. Their civilization, which flourished in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, what historians call Mesopotamia, a word that literally means the land between the rivers, is widely regarded as the first urban civilization in human history. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Eridu, and Lagash were thriving, walled, densely populated centers with irrigation systems, temple bureaucracies, and organized labor, thousands of years before the pyramids of Giza were built. The Sumerians are credited with inventing the first known writing system, cuneiform, somewhere around 3400 to 3200 BCE. They developed the wheel, or at least some of the earliest evidence we have of wheeled vehicles. They built the first ziggurats, massive stepped temple platforms that would later inspire the biblical Tower of Babel. And crucially for this documentary, they were meticulous record keepers. Sumerian scribes trained for years in schools called Ejaba, literally tablet houses, where they learned to press a reed stylus into wet clay, to record everything from beer rations to royal proclamations to epic poetry. Because clay, unlike papyrus or parchment, survives burial and fire remarkably well. In fact, fire actually hardens and preserves clay tablets rather than destroying them. We have an extraordinary volume of surviving Sumerian and later Akkadian and Babylonian texts. Some estimates put the number of excavated cuneiform tablets in the hundreds of thousands, with the vast majority still untranslated, sitting in museum storage rooms in London, Berlin, Chicago, and Baghdad. Among this enormous archive are texts that genuinely do describe the collapse of the world as the Sumerians and their successors knew it. The flood story is the most famous example, but it's far from the only one. There are wisdom texts warning kings not to ignore their advisors. There are law codes obsessed with justice and corruption, written by rulers who clearly feared what would happen if justice broke down. There are astronomical omen texts that treat the movements of Venus and the appearance of comets as portents of coming disaster. There are laments, entire poems, written to mourn the destruction of cities like Ur, describing them in the same breath as descriptions of moral and social collapse. Now here is where we need to be honest with you, the viewer, from the very beginning. Historians broadly agree on what these tablets say. There is very little serious debate, for example, about the fact that the Sumerians wrote a flood narrative, or that the Instructions of Sharupak is a genuine wisdom text warning against poor leadership, or that Sumerian astronomers tracked Venus with startling precision. Where the debate begins is in what these texts mean, and especially in whether they represent something more than ordinary human observation, whether, as some popular theories suggest, they encode forgotten scientific knowledge, warnings from a lost precursor civilization, or even predictions about our own era. Mainstream archaeology tends to view these texts the way we'd view any ancient literature, as products of real people, in a real environment, trying to make sense of real disasters, floods, famines, political collapse, using the religious and cosmological frameworks available to them. When a Sumerian scribe wrote that the gods were angry and sent a flood, most historians read that as an ancient culture's way of explaining a genuinely catastrophic and genuinely mysterious natural event, not as a literal transcript of divine intervention, and not as a coded scientific prophecy. Alternative theories, some from independent researchers, some from popular authors, some from online communities, go further. They argue that the consistency of flood myths across dozens of unconnected cultures points to a real, shared global cataclysm within human memory. They point to the sophistication of Sumerian astronomy and ask whether it implies older, lost knowledge. They connect ancient sky omens to modern ideas about ancient contact with unexplained aerial phenomena. We are going to present both. Where mainstream scholarship has strong evidence, we'll tell you clearly. Where a theory is speculative, unproven, or rejected by most archaeologists, we'll tell you that too. Because the goal of this documentary isn't to convince you that the Sumerians predicted the end of the world. It's to give you the real texts, the real archaeological context, and the real debates, and then let you decide what to make of the pattern that emerges. Because there is a pattern, whether you read it as evidence of a forgotten cycle of civilization or simply as proof that every complex society eventually grapples with the same handful of failure points: corruption, environmental stress, the loss of institutional memory, the arrogance of unchecked power. By the end of this documentary, you'll have seen it laid out in the Sumerians' own words, carved in clay, waiting over 5,000 years to be read. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the water. Chapter 1, Tablet 1, The Great Flood. Long before George Smith translated the Nineveh Flood Tablet in 1872, the Sumerians themselves were already telling this story in a much older form. The oldest known version comes from a text scholars call Eridu Genesis, sometimes referred to as the Sumerian flood story. It survives only in fragments. The tablet was damaged long before modern archaeologists found it, so large sections of the narrative are missing, gaps that historians mark with brackets in translation. But enough survives to reconstruct the outline. In the text, the goddess Nintur laments the creation of humanity and the assembly of gods. The Sumerian pantheon governed itself something like a council, with major deities voting on cosmic decisions, decides to send a flood to destroy mankind. A king named Ziusudra, described as pious and attentive to divine dreams, is warned of the coming catastrophe, seemingly by the god Enki, who at this point in the story is speaking through a wall so as not to be caught directly disobeying the other god's decision. Ziusudra builds a great boat. The flood comes, described as lasting 7 days and 7 nights, sweeping over the land with overwhelming force. When it finally subsides, Ziusudra opens a window, sees the sun, and makes sacrifices in gratitude. He is subsequently granted eternal life and sent to live in a paradise called Dilmun. If elements of that story sound familiar, that's because they are. The same basic structure: divine warning, boat, flood, survivor, sacrifice, and in some versions, a promise never to repeat the destruction, appears again. Epic of Atrahasis, a longer and better preserved Akkadian text from around the 18th century BCE, which gives the flood hero the name Atrahasis and adds an origin story explaining that the gods sent the flood because humanity had become too numerous and too noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. It appears again, in perhaps its most famous ancient form, in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The version George Smith translated. In this telling, the flood hero is named Utnapishtim, and the story is recounted directly to the hero Gilgamesh, who is on a quest to escape death after the loss of his companion Enkidu. Utnapishtim describes being warned by the god Ea, building a massive cube-shaped boat, sealing it with pitch, loading it with his family, craftsmen, and animals, and surviving a flood so violent that even the gods themselves were frightened by what they had unleashed. Afterward, Utnapishtim sends out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, to check for dry land, a detail that will sound immediately familiar to anyone who knows the biblical story of Noah, told in Genesis chapters 6 through 9, which most biblical scholars believe was composed centuries after these Mesopotamian versions, and likely drew on the same regional flood tradition, whether directly or through a shared cultural memory. So we have, within Mesopotamian literature alone, at least 3 major surviving versions of the same essential flood narrative, spanning well over 1,000 years of retelling and adaptation. That alone tells historians something important. This wasn't a minor folktale. It was one of the central stories the Sumerians and their successors told about their own deep past, a foundational trauma, repeated and refined across generations of scribes. Now, here's where the real archaeological detective work comes in. Because the natural question is obvious: was there an actual flood behind this story? The answer, remarkably, is probably yes, though not in the way popular retellings sometimes suggest. In the 1920s, the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating the royal cemetery at Ur, one of the great Sumerian cities, when his team dug down through the normal layers of settlement debris and hit something unusual. A thick layer of water-laid clay, over 2 meters deep in places, containing no artifacts, no pottery, no signs of habitation at all, sandwiched between layers that were clearly full of human occupation both above and below. Woolley concluded, with considerable excitement, that he had found physical evidence of the biblical flood. Later archaeologists were more cautious. Excavations at other Sumerian sites, Kish, Shuruppak, Uruk, found similar flood deposits, but critically, they weren't all the same age, and they weren't all present at every site. Some cities showed evidence of a major flood layer around 2900 BCE, others showed different flooding at different times. What this told archaeologists is that southern Mesopotamia, a low-lying floodplain between 2 major rivers, prone to seasonal and sometimes catastrophic flooding, experienced multiple serious floods over the centuries. Not one single global cataclysm, but a series of regionally devastating events, any and all of which could have fed into a cultural memory that eventually crystallized into the flood story we see in the Eridu, Genesis, and Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh. This is the mainstream historical interpretation. The Sumerians, living on a floodplain where the Tigris and Euphrates could, and did, overflow catastrophically, experienced real, memory-scarring flood events, and preserved that memory in mythological form, attributing the disaster to divine judgment because that was the explanatory framework available to Bronze Age Mesopotamian religion. Over centuries, oral memory of specific historical floods blended and simplified into a single archetypal Great Flood story, the way folk memory often compresses multiple real events into one dramatic narrative. Where things get more speculative, and where we want to be very clear about the line between evidence and theory, is in a separate, much larger scientific debate that some popular writers have connected to the Sumerian flood tradition, the Black Sea flood hypothesis, and the broader question of dramatic sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the 1990s, suggests that around 5600 BCE, rising Mediterranean sea levels breached a natural barrier at what is now the Bosphorus Strait, sending a massive and rapid inflow of saltwater into what had been a much smaller freshwater lake, dramatically expanding the Black Sea and flooding surrounding settlements. Ryan and Pittman speculated that survivors of this event may have dispersed across the region, potentially carrying flood memories with them into the cultures that would later become Sumerian, Anatolian, and even, some have argued, into the deep roots of flood traditions found across Europe and the Near East. It's an intriguing hypothesis, and it remains actively debated. Some marine geologists have found supporting evidence of rapid, dramatic water level change in Black Sea sediment cores. Others have challenged the timeline, the speed of the flooding, and even whether the event would have been catastrophic enough to displace large populations, or dramatic enough to seed a flood myth that traveled thousands of years and thousands of miles into Sumerian tradition specifically. Most mainstream historians remain cautious about drawing a direct line from the Black Sea event to the Sumerian flood texts. The geography, timing, and cultural transmission required are difficult to prove definitively, and the more locally documented Tigris-Euphrates flood layers found by Woolley and others provide a simpler, better evidenced explanation, specifically for the Mesopotamian material. A related and even more broadly discussed idea is the Younger Dryas period, a sudden, sharp return to near-glacial conditions roughly 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, following a period of warming at the end of the last ice age. The Younger Dryas involved rapid climate shifts and, in its aftermath, significant global sea level rise as ice sheets resumed melting. Some researchers have proposed that the flooding of coastal and low-lying settlements during this transition could have left a deep imprint on human cultural memory, one that eventually surfaces in flood myths across many unconnected civilizations, not just Mesopotamia, but ancient Chinese flood traditions surrounding the legendary engineer king, Yu the Great, Mesoamerican traditions among the Maya and Aztec, and flood narratives recorded among indigenous peoples in Australia and the Americas. This is a genuinely active area of scientific research, particularly regarding sea level rise and its effects on early human settlements. But it's important to state plainly that connecting the Younger Dryas specifically to the Sumerian flood tablets, which were written down roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years, the Younger Dryas ended, is a much bigger interpretive leap than connecting them to the well-documented, much more recent Mesopotamian river floods that Woolley and later archaeologists actually excavated. Most Assyriologists, scholars who specialize in Mesopotamian texts and history, treat the flood tablets as reflecting local Tigris-Euphrates flooding, amplified and mythologized over generations, rather than as garbled transmissions of a single Ice Age megaflood. What's undeniable, and what makes this such a compelling starting point for our journey through these tablets, is the itself, a civilization, watching the natural world turn violently against it, choosing to write that trauma down, not simply as a disaster report, but as a moral and cosmic warning. The flood, in Sumerian tradition, isn't presented as a random accident of geography. It's presented as a consequence, a punishment, or in the Atrahasis version, an overreaction to human noise and overpopulation that even troubles the gods who caused it. That framing, catastrophe as consequence, is going to become the single most important thread running through every tablet we examine in this documentary. Because as we're about to see, the Sumerians didn't stop at flood. They kept writing. and their next set of warnings has nothing to do with weather and everything to do with power. Before we move on, hold that thought, because in our next chapter, we're going to look at a tablet that many historians consider one of the oldest pieces of political philosophy in human history. A text written not about gods drowning the earth, but about kings who stop listening. And its warning, some argue, is even more uncomfortable than the flood. Chapter 2, Tablet 2, When Leaders Stop Listening. If the flood tablets represent the Sumerians grappling with nature's power to destroy them, our second tablet represents something arguably more unsettling: the Sumerians grappling with their own power to destroy themselves. The text is known as the Instructions of Shuruppak, named for the ancient city where its central figure, a wise king named Shuruppak, or in some versions, his father Ubara-Tutu, delivers a long series of moral and practical instructions to his son, Ziusudra. Yes, the same Ziusudra who appears as the flood hero in the Eridu Genesis. This connection isn't a coincidence, noted only by fringe theorists. Mainstream Assyriologists have long observed that Mesopotamian scribal tradition deliberately wove these figures together, treating Shurupak's wisdom and Ziusudra's survival of the flood as two parts of the same larger moral narrative. Wisdom preserved, catastrophe survived. The Instructions of Shuruppak is, by most estimates, one of the oldest pieces of wisdom literature ever discovered. Some copies date back to around 2600 BCE, making it possibly older than the oldest surviving fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, and one of the oldest written ethical texts in the archaeological record, predating comparable wisdom literature from Egypt and, by a significant margin, biblical wisdom books like Proverbs. Structurally, it reads almost like a long list of proverbs and practical advice, in the tradition of, "My son, do this, do not do that." Some of the instructions are mundane, advice about farming, about not wading through unfamiliar rivers, about choosing trustworthy business partners. But running through the text is a persistent, deliberate theme: the dangers of poor judgment, particularly among those in positions of authority, and the catastrophic cost of ignoring wise counsel. The text repeatedly warns against arrogance, against acting rashly without consultation, against surrounding oneself with flatterers rather than honest advisors. It emphasizes humility, careful speech, and, critically for the theme of this documentary, the idea that a ruler who does not listen invites disaster not just for himself, but for everyone under his authority. Historians who study Mesopotamian political thought point out that this isn't an isolated sentiment. It echoes throughout the broader corpus of Sumerian and later Akkadian wisdom literature. The Sumerian proverb collections, compiled by scribes over centuries, are full of short, sharp observations about bad leadership. Rulers who oppress their people invite rebellion. Judges who take bribes invite chaos. Cities whose leaders ignore the gods, which in a Sumerian context often functioned as a stand-in for ignoring established law, tradition, and communal well-being, invite ruin. Why would a Bronze Age civilization be so preoccupied with the dangers of bad leadership? The answer lies in how Sumerian city-states were actually structured. Sumer was never a single unified empire for most of its early history. It was a patchwork of independent city-states: Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Kish, and others, each with its own king, its own patron deity, its own temple bureaucracy, and its own military. These city-states cooperated, traded, and intermarried, but they also fought constantly over water rights, farmland, and prestige. The Sumerian king list, another remarkable surviving text, records a shifting sequence of dynasties, with kingship, described almost as a physical object, passing from city to city, sometimes after the flood, in a phrase that directly links political legitimacy to the flood tradition we discussed in Chapter 1. In this environment, effective leadership wasn't an abstract virtue, it was existential. A king who mismanaged irrigation could starve his own city. A king who provoked an unnecessary war could see his city sacked. A king who ignored the advice of experienced administrators, priests, and elders could watch centuries of accumulated infrastructure and social order collapse within a single reign. Historians studying administrative archives from cities like Lagash have found direct evidence of exactly this kind of collapse. The reforms of King Urukagina of Lagash, dated to around 2380 BCE, explicitly describe undoing the corruption of a previous administration, listing specific abuses: officials seizing property, priests overcharging for burial rites, powerful men exploiting the poor, that had accumulated under earlier rulers who, by implication, had stopped listening to the warnings embedded in exactly this kind of wisdom literature. This is what makes the instructions of Shurupak such a striking text to place alongside the flood story, where the flood tablets describe catastrophe imposed from outside, nature, the gods, forces beyond human control. Instructions describe catastrophe that grows from within: bad decisions, arrogance, the refusal to hear uncomfortable truths. And crucially, the text frames this not as an occasional risk, but as a recurring, almost inevitable temptation for anyone who holds power long enough. Some scholars of comparative political thought have pointed out how strikingly this anticipates ideas we associate with much later philosophical traditions. The Greek concept of hubris, the tragic flaw that leads powerful figures to ruin through their own excessive pride. Or the political theory found centuries later in figures like Confucius, who similarly argued that a ruler's legitimacy rested on moral virtue and willingness to receive honest counsel, and that dynasties collapsed not primarily through external invasion, but through the accumulated moral failure of rulers who stopped governing wisely. It's worth being careful here, though. There's no evidence of direct historical influence between Sumerian wisdom literature and Confucian political philosophy, which developed independently over 1,000 years later and thousands of miles away. What we're looking at is convergent human observation, different civilizations, watching the same basic pattern of power, corruption, and collapse play out again and again, and arriving independently at similar warnings. This is a theme worth sitting with, because it recurs constantly throughout Mesopotamian literature in ways that go well beyond this single tablet. The late Curse of Agade. For instance, a poem mourning the destruction of the great Akkadian capital city of Agade, whose exact location remains one of the genuine unsolved mysteries of Mesopotamian archaeology, since it has never been definitively located by excavation, blames the city's fall directly on the arrogance of King Naram-Sin, who is depicted as ignoring omens, defying the will of the gods, and ultimately bringing down divine punishment not just on himself, but on the entire city and its population. Whatever really happened to Agade historically, and there are competing theories involving invasion, drought, and internal political collapse, the Sumerian and Akkadian scribes who wrote about its fall chose, overwhelmingly, to frame the story as a leadership failure with catastrophic consequences. So when we place the instructions of Shurupak alongside the flood tablets, a pattern starts to emerge that will recur throughout the rest of this documentary. The Sumerians did not view catastrophe as random. Whether the disaster came from the sky, from the rivers, or from the throne room, their scribes consistently returned to the same underlying moral structure: warning ignored, consequence delivered. It's tempting, and this is exactly the kind of place where popular retellings sometimes overreach, to read the instructions of Shurupak as a kind of ancient political prophecy, uncannily warning modern societies about the dangers of corrupt or out-of-touch leadership today. We want to be careful with that framing. The text isn't predicting anything specific about the future. It's offering general moral and practical advice, rooted in the very real political turbulence of early Bronze Age Mesopotamia, where the consequences of bad leadership were immediate, visible, and often violent. But general wisdom, precisely because it's general, tends to remain applicable across enormously long stretches of time. That's arguably why the Sumerians kept copying and recopying this text for well over 1,000 years, long after the specific political crises that likely inspired its original composition had been forgotten. Scribes in later Babylonian and Assyrian schools, centuries after Shurupak the city had faded into ruin, were still training students by having them copy out these same instructions about arrogance, corruption, and the dangers of a leader who refuses to listen. The text outlived the specific kings, the specific court intrigues, and even the specific language it was first composed in. It was later translated and adapted into Akkadian, precisely because the pattern it described kept repeating itself. That persistence is worth remembering as we move to our next tablet, because Chapter 3 takes us from the danger of bad leadership in the abstract to something far more concrete: what happens when justice itself breaks down, and how one of history's earliest lawgivers tried, in writing, to stop it before it started. Chapter 3, Tablet 3, The Cities That Forgot Justice. Nearly 1,000 years before Hammurabi carved his famous law code into a towering black stele in Babylon, another Mesopotamian king had already attempted something remarkably similar, and in doing so, left behind what many historians consider the oldest surviving law code in human history. His name was Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, one of the most powerful and best documented periods of Sumerian history, sometimes referred to by historians as the Sumerian Renaissance, for its extraordinary bureaucratic sophistication, monumental building projects, and cultural output. Ur-Nammu ruled roughly from 2112 to 2095 BCE, and under his authority, scribes produced what modern scholars call the Code of Ur-Nammu, predating the Code of Hammurabi by roughly 3 centuries. The tablet itself, along with several partial copies discovered later, opens not with laws directly, but with a prologue, a statement of purpose that historians find just as revealing as the legal clauses that follow. In it, Ur-Nammu describes establishing justice in the land, removing corrupt officials, standardizing weights and measures so merchants could no longer cheat ordinary people, and protecting the vulnerable, specifically naming orphans, widows, and the poor from exploitation by the powerful. What follows is a series of legal provisions covering issues like false accusations, bodily injury, marriage and divorce, and property disputes. One of the most historically significant features of the code, frequently highlighted by legal historians, is that many of its penalties are monetary compensation rather than physical punishment, a notably different approach from the eye for an eye, retribution, more famously associated with the later Code of Hammurabi. Scholars studying the evolution of ancient law see this as an important data point in a much larger question. How did early complex societies attempt to formalize fairness, and why did they feel the need to write it down at all? That last question is worth pausing on, because it connects directly to our theme. Why would a king go to the trouble of commissioning scribes, likely working for months, to carve an entire legal and moral framework into stone and clay, distributed across the kingdom for public reference? The prologue itself gives us the answer. In Ur-Nammu's own words, as preserved in translation, he explicitly frames his legal reforms as a response, a correction to abuses that were apparently widespread before his reign. Corrupt officials seizing property, powerful men exploiting those who couldn't defend themselves. A breakdown, in other words, of the basic trust that allows a complex society to function. This pattern, a ruler explicitly describing existing corruption in order to justify new legal reforms, appears again and again throughout Sumerian and later Mesopotamian history, and it gives historians a rare, direct window into what these societies actually feared most. We touched briefly in Chapter 2 on the reforms of Urukagina of Lagash, which predate Ur-Nammu's code by roughly 2 centuries. Urukagina's inscriptions are even more explicit and specific than Ur-Nammu's, cataloging precise abuses, priests demanding excessive fees for funerals, officials seizing livestock and orchards from ordinary citizens, boat crews and shepherds being exploited by powerful administrators. Urukagina's reforms promised to end these practices and explicitly used the phrase, in translation, that he freed the citizens of Lagash from these abuses, language some historians consider among the earliest recorded use of a concept resembling social liberation from institutional corruption in human history. What's striking, when historians line up these texts chronologically, Urukagina's reforms, then Ur-Nammu's code roughly 2 centuries later, then Hammurabi's far more famous code roughly 3 centuries after that, is that they don't represent one solved problem. They represent the same problem, recurring, generation after generation, dynasty after dynasty, each new ruler apparently needing to reassert, restate, and re-legislate against corruption and injustice that had crept back in since the last reformer's death. This is where we start to see one of the most consistent threads in Sumerian civilization's own self-understanding. The idea that justice is not a permanent achievement, but a constant, fragile effort that requires active maintenance, and that its breakdown is one of the clearest warning signs that a society is heading towards serious trouble. The connection between injustice and societal collapse isn't left implicit in Sumerian literature. It's stated directly, repeatedly, in some of the most emotionally powerful texts to survive from this civilization, the City Laments. We'll discuss one of these, the Lament for in more detail in a later chapter dealing specifically with the destruction of cities, but it's worth introducing here because of how directly it links social injustice to the concept of civilizational punishment. Composed after the historical destruction of by Elamite invaders around 2004 BCE, an event that really happened and is independently corroborated by administrative records, correspondence, and archaeological destruction layers at the site. The lament doesn't simply describe military defeat. It frames the fall of one of the greatest cities in the Sumerian world, in explicitly moral terms, describing the abandonment of the city by its patron deities as a consequence that had been building for reasons connected to the same themes we've been tracing: leadership failure, broken order, divine, which again, in practical terms, often meant social and institutional abandonment. Historians studying the actual, non-mythologized causes of Ur's fall point to a combination of factors that had nothing to do with divine punishment and everything to do with concrete political and environmental stress. The third dynasty of had overextended itself militarily, faced increasing pressure from Amorite and Elamite groups on its borders, and by several archaeological and textual accounts, was struggling with agricultural difficulties. Some scholars point to evidence of increasing soil salinization in southern Mesopotamian fields, a slow-building environmental crisis caused by centuries of irrigation without adequate drainage, which gradually reduced crop yields in exactly the region that needed to feed Ur's dense urban population. We'll return to this environmental angle in much greater depth in Chapter 5, when we look specifically at drought and the Akkadian collapse. But it's worth flagging here because it illustrates something important. When Sumerian scribes wrote about corruption and injustice bringing a city to ruin, they weren't being purely metaphorical. Injustice, in a very concrete and practical sense, undermines a society's ability to respond effectively to real external pressures: military threats, environmental stress, resource shortages, because a population that has lost trust in its institutions, its courts, and its leadership is far less capable of the kind of coordinated, sacrificial response that surviving a genuine crisis requires. This is a theme that resonates well beyond Mesopotamia, and it's worth briefly noting, carefully, without overstating the connection, that other early legal traditions display similar concerns. Egyptian Ma'at. The concept of cosmic and social order that a pharaoh was responsible for upholding functioned in a strikingly similar way to the Sumerian concept of justice, as something actively maintained rather than passively assumed. Egyptian wisdom texts like Instructions of Amenemope likewise warn against corruption, favoritism toward the wealthy, and mistreatment of the poor, in language that echoes, again, likely through independent development rather than direct cultural transmission, since these are separate civilizations with their own distinct legal and religious traditions. The same concerns found in Ur-Nammu's prologue and Urukagina's reforms. Similarly, though separated by vastly greater time and distance, later Chinese legal and philosophical traditions would develop the mandate of heaven concept, in which a ruling dynasty's legitimacy was explicitly tied to just governance, and natural disasters or social unrest were interpreted as signs that a dynasty had lost its moral right to rule. What emerges from comparing these traditions isn't evidence of some single lost global civilization transmitting the same ideas everywhere, as some more speculative theories propose. What emerges is something arguably more interesting from a historical standpoint. independent confirmation, across multiple unconnected early civilizations, that the link between justice and social stability isn't a culturally specific belief. It's a pattern that complex societies, regardless of where or when they develop, seem to rediscover on their own, because it reflects something true about how large groups of humans actually function, cooperate, and eventually fracture. The Code of Ur-Nammu, then, isn't just a historical curiosity, the oldest surviving law code, an impressive first for the history books and little else. Read alongside Urukagina's reforms and the later city laments, it represents one part of a much larger, remarkably consistent Sumerian theory of societal collapse. That corruption and injustice aren't just moral failings to be condemned in the abstract, but genuine structural risks, early warning signs that, left unaddressed, compound over generations until a crisis arrives that a fractured, distrustful society is no longer equipped to survive. That brings us to our fourth tablet, and a very different kind of warning sign. One the Sumerians didn't read in law courts or royal decrees, but in the night sky itself. Next, we'll look at how Sumerian astronomers tracked the movements of Venus with startling precision, and why for them, a wandering star could mean the difference between peace and catastrophe. Chapter 4. Tablet 4. The sky becomes a warning. If you had stood on the roof of a ziggurat in Babylon on a clear night nearly 4,000 years ago, you would likely have found, waiting for you, a priest with a wax writing board, staring intently at a single, brilliant point of light hanging low over the horizon. He would not have been admiring it. He would have been recording it, its exact position, its exact brightness, the exact date, because for the astronomers of ancient Mesopotamia, that point of light was not simply a beautiful object in the heavens. It was a message. That object was Venus, and the text that connects it most directly to our theme of civilizational warning is one of the true masterpieces of ancient observational science, the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa. The tablet, which survives in several later copies, the originals are lost, but scribes in the library of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE preserved copies of a much older text, records the rising and setting times of Venus over a period of about 21 years during the reign of the Babylonian king Amisaduqa, who ruled sometime in the 17th century BCE. For each recorded appearance and disappearance of the planet, the tablet doesn't just note the astronomical event, it pairs it with an omen, a prediction of what that particular celestial behavior meant for the kingdom, the harvest, the king, or the fate of nations. A typical entry might read something like this, in translation: if Venus appears in a certain month and remains visible for a certain duration, then there will be rain and prosperity. If it disappears for an unusually long period before reappearing, then there will be hostility, or the downfall of a foreign king, or famine in a distant land. The tablet systematically works through dozens of these observed patterns, treating the sky as a text to be read, much the way a modern meteorologist reads a satellite image, or a modern economist reads a market index. What makes the Venus tablet such an important document for historians of science isn't the omens themselves, which modern readers will immediately recognize as astrology rather than astronomy in the predictive sense. It's the astronomical data underlying those omens, because Venus follows an extremely regular and mathematically predictable cycle. Its visibility pattern from Earth repeats roughly every 8 years, a cycle Mesopotamian astronomers had clearly identified with impressive precision. The Venus tablet has become one of the most valuable tools modern historians have for anchoring Mesopotamian chronology to an absolute calendar, because the specific pattern of Venus appearances recorded in the tablet only matches certain possible years in antiquity. Astronomers and historians working together have used the tablet to help establish and cross-check the dating of Amisaduqa's reign, and by extension, much of the broader Old Babylonian chronological sequence, including the reign of the far more famous king Hammurabi. This is a genuinely remarkable fact worth sitting with. A religious omen text, composed for the purpose of divination, has become one of modern archaeology's most trusted tools for dating events in the ancient world, because the Babylonians who compiled it were tracking the actual, physical movements of a planet with enough consistency and accuracy that their observations remain scientifically verifiable thousands of years later. This precision wasn't limited to Venus. Sumerian and later Babylonian astronomers, whom historians of science often credit as the true founders of systematic astronomy, tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and visible planets across centuries, compiling enormous observational archives, collectively known as the Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive series of tablets, numbering close to 70 in its most complete surviving form, cataloguing celestial omens related not just to Venus, but to lunar eclipses, solar eclipses, the appearance of comets, and unusual atmospheric phenomena like halos around the moon. Eclipses in particular carried enormous symbolic weight. Babylonian astronomers developed methods for predicting lunar eclipses with real mathematical sophistication, and eclipse omens were taken seriously enough at the royal level that Mesopotamian kings developed an extraordinary countermeasure, the Shapuhi, or substitute king ritual. When astronomers predicted an eclipse considered dangerous to the reigning monarch, a temporary substitute, sometimes a condemned prisoner, sometimes a commoner, would be formally installed on the throne for the duration of the danger period, dressed in royal garments and treated, briefly, as the actual king, so that whatever misfortune the omen predicted would fall on the substitute rather than the true ruler. Afterward, the substitute was typically executed, and the real king resumed his throne, the crisis having been, in the logic of the ritual, successfully redirected. This practice is documented in real royal correspondence and administrative records from the Neo-Assyrian period, and it tells historians something important. These celestial omens were not treated as idle superstition, confined to priestly circles. They shaped actual state policy, actual court behavior, and in this case, actual, if bizarre by modern standards, political ritual at the highest levels of Mesopotamian government. Comets receive similar treatment throughout the omen literature, generally regarded as harbingers of disaster, invasion, plague, the death of a king, their unpredictable appearance in the sky standing in sharp contrast to the reliable, calculable cycles of the planets and eclipses, and for that reason treated as especially ominous. A comet, unlike Venus or the moon, could not be anticipated by calculation, which in the Mesopotamian worldview made it a signal of chaos breaking into an otherwise ordered cosmos, a concept we'll return to directly in Chapter 9 when we discuss how the Sumerians and their successors understood the relationship between cosmic order and civilizational stability. Now, it's worth pausing here to directly address something that inevitably comes up whenever ancient sky-watching cultures are discussed in popular media. The question of whether any of this astronomical activity points toward encounters with something beyond ordinary celestial objects, unexplained aerial phenomena, ancient contact theories, and similar ideas that have become popular in certain corners of alternative history discourse. To be direct and clear, mainstream Assyriology does not interpret the Enuma Anu Enlil, the Venus tablet, or any of the broader Mesopotamian omen literature as evidence of contact with anything beyond ordinary astronomical and atmospheric phenomena. The objects described, Venus, the moon, comets, halos, unusual cloud and light effects around the moon and sun, are all identifiable, known celestial and atmospheric events, and the astronomers recording them were doing so with methods and vocabulary consistent with careful, repeated naked-eye observation of the natural sky, not descriptions of anomalous craft or unexplained technology. Some popular authors and independent researchers have proposed more expansive readings of specific omen texts, suggesting hidden references to ancient aerial visitors. These interpretations are not supported by the broader context of the tablets, which consistently embed these observations within an astrological framework focused on predicting earthly political and agricultural outcomes, rain, war, famine, the fate of specific kings, rather than describing encounters with anything unusual arriving from the sky itself. We flag this distinction clearly, as promised in our introduction, because it's exactly the kind of place where genuine, well-documented ancient science gets blurred with far more speculative modern reinterpretation, and the historical record, read carefully, doesn't support that leap. What the record does support And what deserves genuine appreciation without any embellishment is just how extraordinary Mesopotamian astronomy actually was on its own terms. This civilization developed a base 60 numerical system, the same system that survives today every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes or a circle into 360 degrees, partly in service of increasingly sophisticated astronomical and mathematical calculation. Later Babylonian astronomers, building directly on this Sumerian observational tradition, would go on to develop mathematical methods for predicting planetary positions with an accuracy that wouldn't be matched in the Western world again until the work of Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE, over 1,000 years later, and Ptolemy himself, along with the broader Greek astronomical tradition, explicitly drew on Babylonian observational records and mathematical techniques, a direct, well-documented, and historically significant line of scientific transmission from Mesopotamia into the Greco-Roman world, and from there into the broader foundations of Western astronomy. So why does this matter for a documentary about civilizational collapse? Because embedded within this remarkable scientific tradition was a worldview that treated the sky itself as an early warning system, not in a mystical or paranormal sense, but as an extension of the same anxiety we've traced through every tablet so far. The Mesopotamians, who compiled Enuma Anu Enlil, were, in their own cultural framework, doing exactly what a modern meteorological agency, a modern seismological monitoring network, or a modern epidemiological surveillance system does today, watching for early, subtle signals that might predict a coming disruption to social and agricultural stability, and building institutional structures, priestly colleges, royal advisory systems, the substitute king ritual, to respond to those signals once detected. Read this way: the astronomical omen tradition isn't really a departure from the themes of flood, leadership failure, and injustice we've covered in earlier chapters. It's an extension of the same underlying anxiety, projected onto the one part of the world the Mesopotamians could observe with genuine mathematical precision, but could never actually control: the heavens themselves. Where the flood represented catastrophe from below and corrupt leadership catastrophe from within, the sky omens represented Mesopotamian civilization's attempt to gain some measure of warning, however imperfect, however entangled with religious belief, against catastrophe arriving, quite literally, from above. That anxious, careful watchfulness toward the natural world takes an even more concrete and, frankly, more historically verifiable form in our next chapter, as we move from the unpredictable sky to something the Sumerians and their Akkadian successors understood with grim, first-hand clarity: what happens to a civilization when the rain simply stops coming. Chapter 5, Tablet 5, When Nature Turns Against Humanity. Around 2200 BCE, one of the first great territorial empires in human history collapsed with startling speed. The Akkadian Empire, founded by the legendary king Sargon of Akkad, roughly a century and a half earlier, had unified the independent Sumerian city-states under a single centralized authority for the first time, stretching its influence from the Persian Gulf into what is now Syria and southeastern Turkey. And then, within the span of a few generations, it simply came apart. Mesopotamian scribes writing after the fact were in no doubt about who to blame, as we touched on briefly in Chapter 2. Curse of Agade lays the collapse squarely at the feet of King Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, portraying his arrogance and impiety. He is described as attacking the sacred city of Nippur and defiling its temple, as the direct cause of divine abandonment and the empire's subsequent ruin. It's a compelling, morally satisfying narrative, and it fits neatly into the pattern of leadership failure we explored earlier. But modern archaeology, drawing on evidence entirely unavailable to the ancient scribes who wrote the Curse of Agade, has uncovered a second, parallel explanation, one written not in cuneiform, but in soil. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a team of researchers, led by archaeologist Harvey Weiss, began publishing findings from excavations at Tel Leilan, a site in what is now northeastern Syria, within the broader region historians call the Habura Plains, an area that, during the height of Akkadian power, had been an important agricultural zone, supplying grain to the empire's core. What Weiss's team found was striking: archaeological evidence of a sudden, near-total abandonment of the site around 2200 BCE, precisely coinciding with the period of Akkadian collapse recorded in Mesopotamian texts. Soil analysis from the site revealed a distinct layer of wind-blown dust and sand, indicating a period of severe drought and increased aridity, consistent with settlements being abandoned as agriculture became impossible to sustain. This wasn't an isolated local finding. Around the same time, climate scientists working independently, studying ocean sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman, examining dust deposits that record atmospheric conditions blown in from the Mesopotamian and Arabian regions, identified evidence of a significant, abrupt climate event occurring at almost exactly the same time, roughly 2200 BCE, give or take a few decades depending on the specific dating method used. This event has since become known among climate scientists and archaeologists as the 4.2 kilo-year event, referring to its occurrence approximately 4,200 years before present. Evidence for this event has since been identified in multiple independent locations across the globe, not just Mesopotamian dust records, but stalagmite records from caves in India, sediment cores from lakes in Africa, and archaeological evidence of contemporaneous societal disruption in Egypt, where the Old Kingdom experienced its own dramatic collapse at almost exactly the same time, and in the Indus Valley civilization of South Asia, where major urban centers similarly show evidence of decline and abandonment during this same window. This convergence of evidence, independent climate data from multiple continents, combined with independent archaeological evidence of societal collapse across multiple, unconnected civilizations, all clustering around the same roughly two-century window, represents one of the strongest, most widely accepted cases in all of ancient history for climate change directly contributing to civilizational collapse. It's important to state clearly here, because this is a point where mainstream scholarship and popular retellings sometimes diverge in emphasis. The 4.2 kilo-year event is not a fringe theory. It's a well-documented, actively studied phenomenon within mainstream paleoclimatology and archaeology, discussed in peer-reviewed journals and recognized by the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which in 2018 formally designated the Megalayan age of the current geological epoch as beginning with this event, meaning the 4.2 kilo-year drought is now, quite literally, part of the official geological timescale used to divide up the history of our planet. What does this mean for the Akkadian Empire specifically? The archaeological picture that has emerged, combining Weiss's excavations at Tel Leilan with broader regional surveys, suggests that a sustained, multi-decade reduction in rainfall struck the agricultural regions the Akkadian Empire depended on for grain, particularly the rain-fed farming zones north of the more heavily irrigated southern Mesopotamian heartland. As harvests failed and populations in these northern regions were forced to abandon their settlements, the resulting disruption to trade, taxation, and food supply appears to have placed enormous strain on the empire's centralized administrative system, a system that, unlike the more flexible, smaller-scale governance of individual Sumerian city-states in earlier centuries, depended on maintaining reliable grain surpluses and trade networks across an unusually large and newly unified territory. Some archaeologists studying this period have proposed a term that has since gained wider use in discussions of ancient collapse: systems collapse. The idea that a society doesn't necessarily fall apart because of any single catastrophic event, but because environmental stress exposes and then rapidly unravels underlying structural vulnerabilities that had been building, often invisibly, for generations. In the Akkadian case, the empire's rapid, centrally imposed unification of previously independent city-states, achieved largely through military conquest under Sargon, may have created exactly this kind of hidden fragility, efficient enough to project power and extract resources during good years, but lacking the kind of distributed resilience and local adaptive capacity that had allowed individual Sumerian city-states to survive earlier, more localized environmental crises for centuries. This is where the archaeological and textual evidence, examined together rather than separately, tell a genuinely richer story than either could tell alone. Curse of Agaday. wasn't wrong to connect Naram-Sin's leadership to the empire's collapse. Ancient Mesopotamian texts consistently, and not unreasonably, blamed rulers for failing to manage crises effectively, and a centralized empire straining under drought conditions would have placed enormous pressure on royal decision-making, resource allocation, and the maintenance of political loyalty among increasingly desperate regional governors and city populations. But the text, understandably, had no access to what modern climate science has since revealed, that the pressure Naram-Sin and his successors were straining against wasn't purely a matter of impiety or poor judgment, but a genuine, empire-wide environmental catastrophe unfolding across a period of decades, driven by climatic forces entirely outside any Bronze Age ruler's control or even comprehension. Put simply, the ancient scribes saw a moral failure. Modern archaeology has revealed an environmental one, and the most historically responsible conclusion, supported by the convergence of both lines of evidence, is that these weren't competing explanations, but compounding ones. A genuine climate crisis that exposed and dramatically worsened existing political and administrative weaknesses, producing a collapse that contemporary observers, working within their own explanatory framework, attributed to divine punishment for royal arrogance. This pattern of climate stress, intersecting with political and social vulnerability, recurs elsewhere in Mesopotamian history, and indeed, throughout the broader story we've been tracing across these tablets. We touched briefly in Chapter 3 on evidence of soil salinization contributing to agricultural decline in southern Mesopotamia around the time of Ur's later collapse, a slower-moving, more chronic environmental problem than the abrupt 4.2 kiloyear drought, but one that similarly illustrates how the Sumerians and their successors were locked in a long, difficult relationship with an environment that, while extraordinarily productive when properly managed through irrigation, was also fundamentally fragile, requiring constant maintenance, careful water management, and, crucially, tying back to Chapters 2 and 3, competent, attentive leadership to sustain over the long term. It's worth noting, in the interest of full context, that historians and climate scientists continue to actively debate the precise weight the 4.2 kiloyear event should be given relative to other contributing factors in the Akkadian collapse. Some scholars have pushed back on aspects of Weiss's original Tel Leilan interpretation, questioning the precision of the dating or arguing that political and military factors, including pressure from Gutian and Amorite groups on the empire's borders, deserve more emphasis than a purely climate-driven narrative allows. This is healthy, ongoing scholarly debate, not a case of a fringe theory being uncritically accepted, but even accounting for that debate, the core finding that a significant, well-documented climatic event occurred at almost precisely the moment of Akkadian collapse, and that broadly similar climate signals appear in Egypt and the Indus Valley at the same time, remains one of the better supported connections between environmental change and societal collapse. We'll return to this environmental thread again later in this documentary, because it connects directly and unavoidably to our discussion of modern climate concerns in the final section. But for now, having traced catastrophe through water, through leadership, through justice, through the sky, and through drought, we turn to something the Sumerians considered just as dangerous as any external threat. A danger that required no flood, no invading army, and no failed harvest to bring a civilization to its knees: the corrosive, entirely human forces of greed, pride, and division, working quietly from within. Chapter 6, Tablet 6, Civilization Falls from Within. Not every warning the Sumerians left behind points to an external threat. Some of their most pointed, most enduring texts turn the lens inward, describing the slow, quiet, and in many ways more insidious process by which a society can rot from within, not through any single dramatic disaster, but through the accumulated weight of individual moral failure, greed, arrogance, and the fracturing of communal bonds. This theme runs throughout Sumerian wisdom literature, but nowhere more richly than in the large body of texts scholars group together as Sumerian proverb collections. Thousands of short, sharp sayings, gathered and copied by scribal students over centuries, functioning simultaneously as writing practice, moral education, and a kind of crowd-sourced cultural memory of what a well-ordered life and a well-ordered society were supposed to look like. Many of these proverbs directly target greed and its social consequences. One well-attested Sumerian proverb, preserved across multiple tablet copies, translates roughly to the observation that a rich man's field can be worked, but only through the ruin of the poor man beside it. A blunt acknowledgement that unchecked accumulation of wealth and land by the powerful came at a direct, measurable cost to ordinary farmers and laborers, and was understood by Sumerian society, at least in its moral literature, as a genuine social problem rather than simply an unavoidable feature of economic life. Other proverbs warn against the specific temptations of those who acquire sudden wealth or power, cautioning against arrogance, against forgetting one's origins, and against treating others with contempt once fortune improves. Sentiments that recur across dozens of individual sayings with enough consistency that historians studying this material treat it as reflecting genuine, widely shared social anxiety, rather than the isolated opinion of a single scribe or school. This concern with greed and its corrosive social effects connects directly back to the legal reform texts we examined in Chapter 3. Recall that Urukagina's reforms at Lagash explicitly catalogued abuses by powerful officials seizing property from ordinary citizens, and that Ur-Nammu's Law Code prologue specifically claimed credit for protecting orphans, widows, and the poor from exploitation. These aren't separate concerns from the proverb tradition. They're the same anxiety, expressed in two different registers. The proverbs as everyday moral instruction, circulated broadly through scribal education, and the royal reform texts as formal, state-level acknowledgement that this everyday moral failure, left unaddressed, had become a genuine crisis requiring legal intervention. Pride, meanwhile, receives its own distinct treatment throughout Mesopotamian literature, and arguably nowhere more memorably than in the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, a text we've already discussed in the context of its flood narrative in Chapter 1, but which deserves closer attention here for what it says about the specific danger of arrogant, unchecked power. The epic opens with Gilgamesh as a deeply flawed king. Historians and literary scholars studying the text note that the opening tablets describe him oppressing the people of Uruk, described in some translations as exhausting the young men through relentless labor and mistreating the women of the city, to the point that the citizens cry out to the gods for relief. In response, the gods create Enkidu, a wild man intended initially to serve as a check on Gilgamesh's excesses, a rival strong enough to challenge him. The two ultimately become close companions rather than enemies, and much of the epic's emotional weight rests on this friendship. But it's worth noting that the entire story is set in motion by a king's pride and abuse of power, becoming so severe that even the gods felt compelled to intervene. Later in the epic, after Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh's grief drives him on a desperate quest for immortality, ultimately bringing him to Utnapishtim, the flood survivor from Chapter 1, who tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood specifically to illustrate that not even the gods can grant true immortality outside of exceptional circumstance. And Gilgamesh, after failing a test of endurance and losing a plant capable of restoring youth to a serpent, ultimately returns to Uruk having learned, in the text's own framing, to accept mortality and instead find meaning in the enduring legacy of what he builds, the city walls of Uruk themselves, which the epic's closing lines direct the reader to admire. Historians and literary scholars studying the Epic of Gilgamesh have long read this arc as a deliberate moral structure, a king whose initial arrogance and abuse of power nearly costs him everything, who is humbled through loss and failure, and who ultimately finds wisdom not in personal glory or immortality, but in recognizing his responsibility to the community and infrastructure he leaves behind. It's a strikingly mature meditation on the dangers of unchecked pride for a text well over 4,000 years old, and it reinforces, through narrative rather than direct instruction, the same warning found more explicitly in the instructions of Shurupak, that power without humility, without accountability, without the willingness to be checked and corrected, inevitably produces harm to the ruler himself and to everyone under his authority. Division, the fracturing of communal and social bonds, represents the third major internal threat the Sumerians wrote about, and it appears in Mesopotamian literature both as a cause and a consequence of civilizational decline. The city laments we've referenced several times already, particularly texts like the Lament for Sumer and don't just describe external military destruction. They describe, in vivid and often disturbing imagery, a complete breakdown of ordinary social relationships in the aftermath of collapse. Family members turning against one another out of desperation and famine, trust between neighbors dissolving, the normal structures of household and community life collapsing alongside the physical destruction of the city itself. Whether this represents literal historical reporting or poetic exaggeration for emotional effect is something scholars continue to debate. Ancient laments across many cultures tend to employ hyperbolic imagery of total social breakdown as a literary convention for conveying the depth of a catastrophe. But even read as literary convention rather than literal reportage, the choice to depict collapse specifically through images of fractured family and community bonds, rather than purely through images of physical destruction, tells us something important about what Sumerian scribes considered the truest, most devastating measure of a civilization's fall. Not simply broken walls, but broken relationships. There's a particularly interesting thread here, connecting back to the astronomical omens discussed in Chapter 4. Mesopotamian cosmology, broadly speaking, understood the universe as fundamentally ordered. The regular, predictable movements of the stars and planets, painstakingly tracked by generations of astronomer priests, reflected and reinforced a broader cultural belief in the importance of order itself, at every scale, from the movements of celestial bodies down to the proper functioning of a household, a marketplace, or a royal court. Division, greed, and pride, in this framework, weren't simply personal moral failings in the modern individualistic sense. They represented a kind of disorder, a breakdown of the same underlying principle of proper, balanced relationship that governed everything from planetary movement to social hierarchy to agricultural cycles. A society riddled with greed and internal division was, in the Mesopotamian worldview, out of alignment with the fundamental order the gods had established for the cosmos, and history, in the form of collapse and disaster, was the inevitable correction. This is a genuinely useful lens for understanding why the Sumerians treated internal moral failure with the same seriousness they gave to floods, droughts, and celestial omens. From a modern, secular historical perspective, we might simply say that societies with high levels of corruption, inequality, and social fragmentation are less resilient, less capable of coordinated response to external shocks, and more prone to internal conflict that compounds whatever other pressures they're facing. A conclusion modern sociologists and political scientists studying state collapse have reached independently through very different methodologies, and which broadly aligns with what the Sumerians expressed in the religious and moral language available to them 4,000 years ago. Whether we frame it as divine punishment for pride, as the Sumerians did, or as a structural loss of social resilience, as a modern political scientist might, the underlying observation is remarkably consistent across an extraordinary span of human history. Greed corrodes trust, pride blinds leadership to genuine risk, and division weakens a society's capacity to respond collectively when real crises, whether floods, droughts, invasions, or something else entirely. And that brings us to a problem the Sumerians took perhaps more seriously than any other, because it threatened not just their present stability, but their ability to learn from the past at all. The danger of losing the accumulated knowledge that might have helped them recognize these warning signs in the first place. That's where we're headed next, into the burning libraries and the slow, quiet tragedy of forgotten knowledge. Chapter 7. Tablet 7. The Loss of Knowledge. In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard was excavating the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient capital of the Assyrian Empire, on the banks of the Tigris River near modern-day Mosul, Iraq. Digging into the remains of a royal palace complex, his team began uncovering room after room filled with something unexpected. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, many broken, some remarkably intact, stacked and scattered across the floors in what had clearly once been an organized collection. Layard, and the archaeologists who continued the excavation after him, had stumbled onto what is now recognized as one of the most important single archaeological discoveries in the history of Mesopotamian studies. The Library of Ashurbanipal, assembled during the reign of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, in the 7th century BCE. By most modern estimates, the library once held somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 tablets and fragments, covering an almost unimaginable range of subject matter: religious and magical texts, medical treatises, astronomical and astrological omens like the ones we examined in Chapter 4, royal correspondence, historical chronicles, grammatical and lexical texts used for training scribes, literary works including the most complete surviving version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and administrative records documenting the day-to-day operation of the Assyrian state. What makes this discovery so significant for our documentary isn't simply its scale, though the scale is genuinely staggering. It's the fact that this library survived at all, and the specific, almost paradoxical reason why. Ashurbanipal's library was destroyed in 612 BCE, when a coalition of Babylonian, Median, and allied forces sacked Nineveh, bringing an end to the Assyrian Empire after centuries of dominance in the region. The city was burned. The palace complex housing the library was burned along with it. And in an outcome that surprises many people encountering this history for the first time, that fire is precisely what preserved the collection for archaeologists to find nearly 25 centuries later. Unbaked clay tablets, left exposed to moisture and the elements, gradually dissolve and crumble over centuries. But intense heat from a catastrophic fire, of exactly the kind that swept through Nineveh during its destruction, actually bakes clay tablets hard, effectively firing them like pottery in a kiln, dramatically increasing their durability and their chances of surviving intact until modern excavation. The very violence that ended Ashurbanipal's kingdom is the reason we can read his library's contents today. This is a genuinely remarkable historical irony, and it's worth sitting with, because it sets up a much darker question that historians of the ancient world have grappled with extensively. How much Mesopotamian knowledge was lost, permanently and irretrievably, in destructions that didn't happen to preserve their contents the way Nineveh's fire accidentally did? The honest answer, acknowledged by essentially every scholar working in this field, is that we don't know, and we can't know, and that not knowing is itself one of the most important facts about studying ancient Mesopotamia. Cities were destroyed, burned, abandoned, and built over across roughly 3,000 years of Mesopotamian history. Some destructions preserved their tablet archives through fire, as at Nineveh. Others didn't. Libraries and archives housed in buildings that collapsed without burning, or that were exposed to centuries of flooding and groundwater before later excavation, have yielded far less legible, far more fragmentary material, and in many cases, nothing survived at all. Archaeologists studying Mesopotamian scribal culture broadly agree that the tablets we've recovered, even accounting for the hundreds of thousands of fragments held in museum collections worldwide, almost certainly represent only a small fraction of everything that was originally written down across the full span of Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian civilization. This problem is compounded by a second, more subtle form of knowledge loss: the gradual death of cuneiform literacy itself. Cuneiform writing, and the Akkadian and Sumerian languages it was primarily used to record, remained in active use for an extraordinary span of time, well over 3,000 years, from its earliest development around 3400 to 3200 BCE, through to the last known cuneiform tablets, which are astronomical texts dated to the 1st century CE, meaning cuneiform writing was still being used, in at least specialized contexts, at roughly the same time the Roman Empire was expanding, under emperors like Trajan. But its use narrowed dramatically over its final centuries, as Aramaic and later Greek following Alexander the Great's conquests became the dominant languages of administration and daily life across Mesopotamia. Cuneiform increasingly retreated into the hands of a small, specialized class of scribes and priests, preserving primarily religious, astronomical, and scholarly texts, until eventually, the knowledge of how to read the script at all simply died out with the last generation of practitioners who had learned it. By the time European travelers and early archaeologists began encountering cuneiform inscriptions in the 17th and 18th centuries, no living person on Earth could read a single word of it. The script that had once recorded the daily life, laws, science, and literature of the world's first cities had become, quite literally, an unreadable mystery carved into stone and clay. It would take until the mid-19th century, through the painstaking, decades-long work of scholars including Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and later George Smith, the same George Smith whose flood tablet discovery opened this documentary, working primarily from the trilingual Behistun inscription, a massive rock-cut proclamation of the Persian king Darius the Great, carved in 3 different cuneiform scripts, to finally crack the code and begin systematically translating Mesopotamian texts again, roughly 2,000 years after the last person who could natively read them had died. Historians and specialists in what's sometimes called the study of knowledge loss, an interdisciplinary field examining how and why societies lose access to previously held information, technology, and skill, point to the Mesopotamian case as one of history's clearest examples of what can happen even when the physical evidence survives. The tablets sat in the ground, intact, for over 2,000 years. The information they contained wasn't destroyed in any physical sense, but without anyone left alive who could interpret the script, that information was, for all practical purposes, completely inaccessible, lost not because the medium failed, but because the specialized human knowledge required to unlock the medium disappeared. This distinction matters enormously for how we think about knowledge loss more broadly, and it's exactly the kind of distinction that becomes relevant when we turn, as promised, to compare this ancient case with a very different kind of vulnerability affecting archives today. Modern librarians, archivists, and digital preservation specialists have increasingly drawn direct comparisons between the fate of ancient cuneiform literacy and a phenomenon sometimes called digital obsolescence, or the digital dark age, the concern that vast quantities of information created and stored in digital formats today may become effectively unreadable within decades, not centuries, due to the rapid pace of technological change. Unlike a clay tablet, which can be physically read by anyone who understands the underlying script, regardless of how the object itself is stored, digital information depends on an unbroken chain of compatible hardware, software, and file formats to remain accessible. Floppy disks, early CD-ROM formats, obsolete file formats, and even entire programming languages and operating systems have already become difficult or impossible for ordinary users to access within a single human lifetime, a pace of obsolescence that dramatically outstrips even the multi-century decline of cuneiform literacy. Organizations including UNESCO, the Internet Archive, and various national libraries have specifically cited concerns about long-term digital preservation, warning that enormous quantities of scientific data, government records, personal archives, and cultural material created since the 1980s already exist in formats that are difficult to access without specialized, increasingly rare expertise or hardware, echoing, in a compressed and accelerated form, exactly the kind of knowledge fragility that left Ashurbanipal's library sitting unread in the ground for over 2,000 years. It's a comparison worth taking seriously, specifically because it isn't a stretch or a forced parallel. It's a pattern computer scientists and archivists themselves actively invoke when explaining the stakes of digital preservation to policymakers and the public, precisely because the ancient Mesopotamian case offers such a clear, well-documented historical precedent for what happens when the technical or linguistic key to a body of knowledge is lost, even while the raw information technically still exists somewhere. There's a further layer to this story worth including, because it complicates any simple narrative of steady decline followed by rediscovery. Ashurbanipal himself, according to his own surviving inscriptions, was keenly aware of the risk of losing access to older knowledge, and explicitly framed his library-building project as an effort to preserve and gather texts from across his empire and from earlier periods of Mesopotamian history, some of which were already, in his own time, considered ancient and difficult to obtain. In other words, the king who assembled this extraordinary collection was himself responding to an already recognized anxiety about knowledge loss, actively working to counteract the erosion of access to older Sumerian and Babylonian texts, even as Assyrian civilization was, unknowingly, less than a century away from its own catastrophic collapse. Ashurbanipal's preservation project didn't ultimately save his empire from destruction, But it did, through the strange mechanism of that destruction's own fire, preserve an extraordinary window into everything his civilization knew, feared, and valued, for us to recover millennia later. This gives us, in a sense, a final layer to add to the pattern we've been tracing throughout this documentary. The Sumerians and their successors didn't just write about floods, corrupt leadership, broken justice, ominous skies, and devastating drought. They also, quite explicitly, worried about their own capacity to remember and transmit warnings about all of these things to future generations, recognizing, correctly as it turns out, that even the most carefully recorded knowledge is only as durable as the chain of people willing and able to keep reading it. Next, we turn to a different kind of anxiety recorded in the Mesopotamian sky-watching tradition. Not the calculable, predictable movements of Venus and the Moon we discussed in Chapter 4, but something far stranger and more unsettling. The ancient record of things in the sky that Mesopotamian observers themselves couldn't easily explain. Chapter 8. Tablet 8. Strange objects in the sky. Among the tens of thousands of astronomical and omen tablets recovered from Mesopotamian sites, the vast majority describe exactly the kind of regular, predictable celestial phenomena we discussed in Chapter 4. The movements of Venus, the phases of the Moon, the timing of eclipses. But scattered throughout this enormous body of material are a smaller number of texts describing something different, unusual, unexpected, and sometimes genuinely difficult for modern scholars to identify with confidence. Irregular lights, strange atmospheric phenomena, and celestial events that fell outside the predictable cycles Mesopotamian astronomers had otherwise mastered so impressively. Before going further, it's worth being unusually direct about the state of scholarship here, because this is a topic where popular retellings frequently outrun what the actual textual and archaeological evidence supports. The vast majority of professional Assyriologists who study these unusual sky omen texts interpret them as ancient attempts to record and interpret real, but at the time poorly understood, atmospheric and astronomical phenomena, things we would today identify readily using modern science, but which a Bronze or Iron Age observer, without telescopes, without an understanding of atmospheric optics, and without a modern astronomical framework, could only describe in the descriptive, often metaphorical language available to them. This category includes things like meteor showers and fireballs, unusual atmospheric halo effects caused by ice crystals refracting light around the sun or moon, auroral displays, the northern lights, which, while rare at Mesopotamia's relatively low latitude, can and occasionally do become visible much further south than usual during periods of intense solar activity, and comets, which we touched on in Chapter 4 as objects of particular dread precisely because their unpredictable appearance disrupted the otherwise orderly, calculable nature of the Mesopotamian sky. Scholars have also pointed to genuine ambiguity in how certain Akkadian and Sumerian astronomical terms should be translated. Words used to describe unusual celestial objects sometimes carry connotations that are difficult to pin down precisely. Terms that might describe a bright meteor, a comet, an unusually positioned planet, or an atmospheric phenomenon, depending on context, and where the surviving tablets don't always provide enough surrounding detail for modern translators to be completely certain which specific phenomenon a given scribe was describing. This translational ambiguity is a real, acknowledged challenge within the field, openly discussed in academic literature on Mesopotamian astronomy, and it's precisely this genuine, acknowledged uncertainty that has, in popular and alternative history circles, sometimes been stretched into much bolder claims than the evidence actually supports. It's in this gap, between honest, scholarly uncertainty about specific ambiguous terms and a desire among some popular authors for more dramatic explanations, that theories connecting ancient Mesopotamian sky omens to modern ideas about unexplained aerial phenomena or ancient contact have taken root. These theories typically point to specific omen texts describing unusual lights or objects moving through the sky, sometimes described using terms that can be translated as fiery or compared to weapons or divine chariots, and argue that these descriptions represent genuine eyewitness accounts of something beyond ordinary natural phenomena. To evaluate this claim honestly, it helps to understand how Mesopotamian religious and poetic language typically worked. Gods, in Sumerian and Akkadian cosmology, were regularly associated with celestial objects and phenomena as a matter of standard religious convention, not as literal physical descriptions. Venus, for example, was directly identified with the goddess Inanna, or Ishtar in Akkadian, and astronomical texts routinely describe the planet's movements using language that blends observational astronomy with the goddess's mythological attributes and personality. Divine weapons, fiery chariots, and similarly dramatic imagery appear constantly throughout Mesopotamian literature as standard poetic and religious vocabulary used to describe gods, their power, and their actions generally, not specifically or uniquely applied to unusual sky phenomena. A storm god's weapon, a solar deity's radiance, a divine chariot crossing the heavens. These are conventional metaphors embedded throughout the broader literary and religious tradition, appearing in contexts that have nothing to do with unusual astronomical events at all. When this same conventional religious vocabulary appears in an omen text describing an unusual meteor or comet, most Assyriologists read it as the expected application of standard poetic and religious language to a genuinely unusual, but still fundamentally natural, celestial event, rather than as literal, eyewitness description of an unidentified technological object. This is a genuinely important distinction, methodologically, and it's worth explaining why historians insist on it so consistently. Ancient religious texts across essentially every culture routinely use elevated, dramatic, mythologically loaded language to describe natural phenomena, storms, eclipses, comets, earthquakes, because that mythological framework was the primary interpretive lens available to people trying to make sense of the natural world before the development of modern scientific explanation. Reading this kind of conventional religious language literally, as a direct physical description, rather than as culturally expected poetic and theological expression, risks fundamentally misunderstanding how ancient peoples actually thought and wrote, treating figurative, symbolically loaded religious vocabulary as if it were meant to function like a modern technical incident report, which is not the genre these texts belong to, nor how their original audience would have understood them. None of this means the underlying human experience being described wasn't genuinely striking or frightening to the people who witnessed it. A large fireball meteor, a comet suddenly appearing in the sky, an unusual auroral display at Mesopotamia's latitude, or a particularly dramatic solar or lunar halo would all have been visually arresting, unexpected, and, for an observer without a modern astronomical or atmospheric framework, genuinely difficult to explain through ordinary means. The fear, awe, and dramatic language found in these tablets almost certainly reflects real human reactions to real, if today easily identifiable, natural events, filtered through the religious and poetic conventions available to Mesopotamian scribes. It's worth pointing out, in fairness to the broader historical record, that other ancient cultures documented similarly dramatic and sometimes ambiguous celestial observations, and mainstream historians of science generally interpret those records the same way. Chinese astronomical records, among the most detailed and continuous in the ancient world, include extensive documentation of what Chinese astronomers termed guest stars, a category that modern astronomers have since identified as including novae, supernovae, and comets, most famously the supernova of 1054 CE, independently recorded by Chinese and Japanese astronomers, whose remnant modern astronomers have identified as the Crab Nebula, one of the most studied objects in modern astrophysics. Roman and Greek sources similarly document unusual celestial events using dramatic, sometimes militaristic, or omen-laden language. Comets described as portending the deaths of emperors, unusual lights interpreted as signs of divine favor or displeasure. In none of these better-studied cases do mainstream historians of science interpret this dramatic, culturally conventional language as evidence of anything beyond natural astronomical and atmospheric phenomena, described through the explanatory and poetic frameworks available at the time. There's no principled reason, most Assyriologists argue, to interpret the Mesopotamian material differently simply because Cuneiform is a less widely known script to the general public than Chinese astronomical records or classical Greek and Roman sources. This isn't to dismiss the genuine sense of mystery and wonder these ancient texts can evoke, or to suggest there's nothing left to learn from them. There absolutely is, and ongoing academic research continues to refine translations, resolve ambiguous terminology, and occasionally identify specific historical celestial events, like eclipses or comet appearances, with enough precision to help date other events in Mesopotamian chronology. The honest, evidence-based version of this story is genuinely fascinating on its own terms. A civilization watching the sky with remarkable persistence and mathematical sophistication, encountering occasional, genuinely unusual phenomena they couldn't fully explain, and recording their fear and wonder using the rich religious and poetic vocabulary available to them, without needing to reach for explanations involving ancient visitors or unexplained technology to find that story compelling. What these strange sky texts do share, genuinely and without any need for embellishment, with the broader collection of tablets we've examined throughout this documentary, is their function within the larger Mesopotamian worldview we discussed in Chapter 6. The idea of a cosmos that was fundamentally ordered, and in which any disruption to that order, whether a comet breaking the predictable rhythm of the planets, or a corrupt official breaking the predictable rhythm of justice, was read as a meaningful signal, a disturbance worth recording, interpreting, and responding to. It's this deep cultural instinct, the conviction that disorder anywhere in the system, whether cosmic or civic, was a warning worth taking seriously, that carries us directly into our next tablet, and into one of the most explicitly cyclical visions of history to survive from the ancient world. Chapter 9, Tablet 9, The Return of Chaos. Underlying nearly every tablet we've examined so far is a concept that doesn't always announce itself directly in any single text, but that scholars of Mesopotamian religion and cosmology consider absolutely central to understanding how the Sumerians and their successors actually thought about history, disaster, and time itself. The idea that order and chaos were locked in a permanent, ongoing struggle, and that civilization itself was best understood not as a fixed, permanent achievement, but as a fragile, temporary victory that had to be actively maintained, and that could, under the wrong conditions, be lost and would need to be won again. This concept is often discussed by scholars using the Sumerian and Akkadian term me, a notoriously difficult word to translate precisely into English, but generally understood to refer to the fundamental divine ordinances, powers, or attributes that govern civilization itself: kingship, priesthood, law, the arts, writing, even more specific and surprisingly mundane concepts like the art of the courtesan or the making of weapons, all appear in surviving lists of the me. According to Sumerian mythology, these me were originally held by the god Enki in his city of Eridu, widely regarded, both in Sumerian tradition and in modern archaeology, as one of the oldest cities in Mesopotamia, sometimes described in Sumerian texts as the first city ever created. The goddess Inanna, in a well-known myth called Inanna and Enki, travels to Eridu, gets Enki drunk at a feast, and successfully persuades him to grant her the me, which she then carries back triumphantly to her own city of Uruk, a myth scholars widely interpret as reflecting a real historical shift in political and religious prestige from the older city of Eridu to the rising power of Uruk, encoded in mythological rather than purely historical form. What matters for our purposes is the underlying assumption embedded in this myth that the fundamental building blocks of civilization, order, kingship, law, craft, culture itself, were not considered permanent, self-sustaining features of the world. They were treated as divine gifts, held and transferred, capable of being won, lost, stolen, or neglected, and requiring active maintenance by human institutions, kings, priests, scribes, to remain functional within any given city or society. This framework helps explain something that might otherwise seem strange about Mesopotamian civilization when viewed from a distance. Despite building some of the most sophisticated cities, legal systems, and scientific traditions of the ancient world, Sumerian and later Mesopotamian culture doesn't display the kind of confident, linear, ever-improving view of historical progress that later Western thought, particularly since the Enlightenment, has often assumed as a default way of understanding history. Instead, Mesopotamian historical and religious texts repeatedly return to a much more cyclical, anxious vision. Civilizations rise, achieve genuine greatness, and then fall, sometimes through external catastrophe, sometimes through internal moral and administrative failure, sometimes, as we saw clearly in Chapter 5, through a devastating combination of both, and the fundamental forces of disorder that civilization had temporarily held at bay come flooding back in, whether literally, as in the flood narratives of Chapter 1, or figuratively, as in the social breakdown described in the city laments we discussed in Chapter 6. The Sumerian king list, which we touched on briefly in Chapter 2, offers one of the clearest textual illustrations of this cyclical thinking in action. The list records a long sequence of dynasties and kings, tracking the transfer of kingship from city to city across Mesopotamian history, but it explicitly, directly incorporates the flood as a structural dividing point within its own historical framework, describing a set of impossibly long-reigning kings who ruled before the flood, followed by the flood itself sweeping over the land, followed by kingship descending from heaven once again afterward, and a new sequence of dynasties beginning. Whatever the king list's more fantastical elements, and the pre-flood reign lengths, running into the tens of thousands of years for individual kings, are understood by essentially all modern historians as legendary rather than literal historical claims. Its underlying structural assumption is telling. History itself, in the Mesopotamian imagination, was understood as something that could be catastrophically interrupted and then restarted, order collapsing into chaos, and chaos being reorganized back into order, in a pattern the text presents as having already happened at least once before, and by clear implication, as something that could happen again. This cyclical anxiety connects directly and clearly to everything we've discussed across the previous 8 chapters. The flood represents chaos, overwhelming order from outside. Bad leadership, as in the instructions of Shuruppak, represents order collapsing from a failure of human wisdom and restraint. Broken justice, as in the reforms of Ur-Nammu and Urukagina, represents the social fabric of order fraying from within. Drought and the Akkadian collapse represent environmental chaos, overwhelming administrative order. Greed, pride, and division, as we saw in Chapter 6, represent moral chaos, corroding social order from the inside out. And the loss of the library of Ashurbanipal's readable knowledge, discussed in Chapter 7, represents perhaps the most poignant version of this cycle. Even the accumulated wisdom meant to help future generations recognize and prevent these patterns is itself vulnerable to being lost to the same fundamental forces of decay and disorder. Scholars of comparative religion and mythology have long noted that this fundamental order versus chaos framework, while expressed in culturally specific terms in Mesopotamia, appears with remarkable consistency across a wide range of ancient civilizations, again generally understood as a case of independent human cultures, arriving separately at similar conceptual frameworks for understanding and genuinely universal feature of complex societies, rather than evidence of direct cultural transmission between unconnected regions. Ancient Egyptian religion centered heavily on the concept of Ma'at, cosmic, social, and moral order, locked in permanent tension with Isfet, representing chaos and disorder, with the pharaoh's central religious duty understood as actively maintaining Ma'at against the constant threat of Isfet breaking through. Hindu cosmology developed an elaborate cyclical framework of yugas, vast ages of the world, understood to progress from periods of greater order and virtue toward periods of increasing moral and social decay, culminating in dissolution and eventual renewal, in a cosmic cycle repeating across almost unimaginably long timescales. Even within the biblical tradition, which developed within the broader ancient Near Eastern cultural sphere and shows clear points of contact with Mesopotamian literature, most obviously in the flood narrative we discussed extensively in Chapter 1. Later apocalyptic literature develops its own distinct vision of history, moving through periods of corruption and crisis toward eventual judgment and renewal. It's genuinely important, in the interest of the careful, evidence-based approach we committed to at the start of this documentary, to note that these parallels represent broadly convergent human thought patterns rather than proof of some single shared source civilization, transmitting identical ideas to unconnected cultures around the globe, a claim sometimes made in more speculative popular literature, but one that isn't supported by the actual textual, archaeological, or linguistic evidence connecting these traditions, which in most cases developed independently, reflecting genuinely separate cultural and religious histories. What the parallels do suggest, and this is a conclusion well within mainstream scholarly consensus, is that the underlying experience being described, the real, observable vulnerability of complex human societies to collapse, and the psychological and cultural need to make sense of that vulnerability through some kind of order